Hello, before we get started, I'd like to take the time to share a promo from a podcast that I think my listeners might enjoy.
I'm Jaimie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. We're the host of the Strictly Stalking Podcast.
Strictly Stalking is a true crime podcast that explores stalking stories told by the survivors in their own words.
Join us every Tuesday as we interview survivors, advocates, and experts to give you a deep dive into the workings of a stalking case.
Would you know where to turn if you or someone you know is being stalked? We'll also give you the resources to fight back, know your rights, and get justice.
Find Strictly Stalking wherever you listen to podcasts from Podcast One.
Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This is the 293rd episode of California Dreaming, and I have a few notes to share with you before we get going. If you've been listening to the show for a while, then you know for at least the past 7 years, this has pretty much been a one-woman show, and I have relied on Patreon subscriptions to keep it up and running. I've been making a renewed effort to reconnect with patrons, old and new, by sending out new rounds of thank you gifts for your support. Many of you have posted that you have received your gifts in the mail, so I'm glad to know that you're getting them. If you haven't received anything in the mail from me yet and are expecting to, I'll be mailing out more soon. If after a few more weeks you still haven't received anything, then make sure you message me on Patreon or email me, and I'll make sure to add you to my mailing list. I had a plan for this episode, but it's actually a pretty complicated case, and I recently watched some of the newest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix, and that's where I heard about this story, and I wanted to jump all over this one instead. Anyway, this intro has been long enough, so I'm going to skip all the normal stuff that I say, and let's get started with this story. This is the tale of the severed head of Economy Borough, Pennsylvania. On December 12, 2014, a 15-year-old returning from some hunting activities made a grisly discovery a few yards off the side of a country road in Economy, a borough located in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. That discovery was a severed head. So this place is called Economy Borough, but for the rest of the episode, I'm just going to call it Economy. If you've had the opportunity to watch the Unsolved Mysteries about this story, it opens with the 911 call, which was made to report what this 15-year-old had found. And you can hear the anxiety and the urgency in his voice as he tells the 911 operator that he just found a severed human head. This would mark the beginning of a mystery that persists to this day. How is it that the severed head came to be off this rural road? Where did it come from? What happened to this person that caused them to be separated from their body? Who placed it there? But most importantly, who does this head belong to? Because to this day, the identity of the severed head of Economy, Pennsylvania remains unknown. From the location of the head, the way that it was placed, it wasn't like there was any obvious attempt at concealing it. So this had investigators thinking that whomever it was that left it there wanted it to be discovered. This head just didn't roll out of nowhere and boom, land right there. Somebody is responsible for that head being at that location. But if investigators can't even identify who the head belongs to, finding out who dumped this person's head off the side of the road feels virtually impossible. So, dreamers, normally if we're dealing with the discovery of body parts, there is usually some sort of murder event that had taken place and an investigation ensues, correct? And one of the first places the investigation goes, if not the first place, would be to any missing persons reports that matches the victim. If they had found the severed head of a Hispanic woman, then they're going to go look for reports on a missing Hispanic woman in the area, right? Or the surrounding areas. But what if this quote-unquote victim was never reported missing? It's rare, but it has happened in cases that we've covered. Vulnerable individuals who might be going through some rough time in their life and they kind of drop in and out of touch with their families and loved ones. So if something does happen to that person, the family doesn't necessarily know that something is wrong because they don't keep in regular touch. So yeah, are these investigators going to take a look through missing persons reports to see if the severed head matches any of those individuals that have been reported missing? In this case, that's not the direction that they're going to be finding themselves going. And the reason for this is because this particular severed head had been put through a complete professional embalming process. This person that this head belongs to died, and the people in their life were very well aware of it. The head was that of an elderly woman. Well, that's what is often described in the media and articles that I've read about this story. But I think the best guess is that she's somewhere in her mid-60s, no older than maybe 80-ish. But that doesn't really feel so elderly anymore now that I'm pushing half a century myself, but I digress. This woman died, she was embalmed, and at some point her head became disarticulated from the rest of her and ended up out there in this field or forest in Economy, Pennsylvania. In the introduction of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, one of the people being interviewed said something along the lines of this head being that of somebody's loved one. The family may not even know she's out there. And you know, that's true. They most likely have no idea because they think she's already been buried or cremated. They expect that to be the case since she's been embalmed, completely prepared for her wake or her viewing or her funeral. But as I stated, at some point following that, some, if not all of her, did not end up with the remainder of her body in wherever her final resting place may be. If her family visits her grave, or if they have her ashes, they, in most probability, have no idea that they're not visiting all of her. Economy is a very nice area dotted with beautiful homes. For the most part, it's considered safe. If there is crime, it usually doesn't take very long to figure out who and what is involved and close the case because the fact that it's not that big of a town. On Unsolved Mysteries, one of the members of local law enforcement said that crime was mostly like one guy shoots another guy and everyone usually knows who did it, even before police and paramedics get there to help, and then they move on to the next thing. So for investigators in Beaver County to be hung up and stuck on this Jane Doe severed head case is something that they can't and won't let go of until they figure it out. Only then do they allow themselves to move on. No other case comes close to being anything like this one for their department. When that 15-year-old, who remains unnamed and unidentified, made that 911 call about discovering the severed head, he was instructed to go and stand where the head was and to wait for authorities to arrive. Officers were radioed and they headed over to the scene. The first officer to arrive spotted the young man standing at the side of the road. He pointed over towards the general location of where the head was. You know, I was going to say, I wouldn't want to do what the 911 operator told this 15-year-old to do, to go and stand by the head. Like, I said it was some yards off the side of the road, so I'd just leave it to investigators now that I think about it. The 911 operator should have told him to stay away from the head, but to hang out nearby in order to direct first responders to its location. But anyway, before the officer went down there to check out the head, he asked this kid if he had touched the head at all, and he said that he had not. And you know, now that I'm thinking about it again, from the sounds of that 911 operator, it doesn't seem like this discovery that was made on the side of the road was being taken very seriously at this point. The investigator stated in the Unsolved Mysteries episode that this was going to end up being some kind of practical joke that somebody was pulling. So even the first responding officers didn't have all of this urgency about this severed head. But when the officer got a closer look at it, he was like, yeah, this is definitely a real severed human head. And he said that he radioed his commanding officer and let him know that they've got a very serious problem going on over here. And so the police chief, when he got the phone call, he made it sound like his officers don't call him for anything unless it's pretty serious. So for him, it became urgent immediately. He's headed to the scene and he's thinking, what the hell is going on here? A severed head? All these questions began to percolate. Whoever put the head out there in the woods must be one very demented individual. Are we dealing with some sort of sadistic killer? Is there a serial killer? Are we going to find more heads or other body parts? Where is the cutting up of these bodies taking place, and who is tossing them around town? Well, the police chief decided to call upon the assistance of a gentleman by the name of Andy Gall. Remember him, he's a very important person in this story. The Unsolved Mysteries episode didn't get too much into details about Andy Gall, but he was interviewed in the episode and he stated, "I've always been the go-to guy. Something weird happens, it's call Andy." I looked him up and there isn't a ton of information on him, but I did find an article that he wrote in December of 2016 on CBS.com about a case unrelated to this one. But it kind of gives you an idea of another case in Beaver County that he worked that had gone cold. I'm just going to read you the article and I'll link it in the show notes. I know this is getting off topic, but I ran across this story and I had never heard of it before. And once I started getting into the details, I was like, I have to tell the listeners about this. So we're going to be off topic for a few minutes and I'm so sorry. But, oh well, you know how I am. Andy Gall was a first responder in 1979 to the scene where 23-year-old Catherine Janet Walsh was found murdered in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. Now a detective in the same county, Gall was an integral part of closing the case 34 years later. Gall was featured in the 48 Hours investigation into Walsh's murder called Janet's Secret. Here, he reflects on the haunting cold case. Andy Gall wrote, "In 1979, at the age of 25, I was a very young patrolman with the Monaca." I'm going to check pronunciation on that one real quick. Yep, I was wrong. It's Monaca, Pennsylvania. Monaca Police Department in Beaver County. Okay, where was I? I was a very young patrolman with the Monaca Police Department in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. I had a little education, a fair amount of self-confidence, and a lot of ambition. I had hoped to someday become a detective and investigate serious crimes. On Labor Day of that year, I responded to my first whodunit homicide as the first officer on the scene. When I got that fateful radio call, I felt I was fully prepared and thought I had a plan to handle anything. I walked in the door and met the victim's father and then saw the victim, 23-year-old Catherine Janet Walsh, lying face down in her bed. Her hands were bound behind her back and she had been strangled with a bandana. When I looked back at her father and saw the look on his face, my plan fell apart immediately. I had not prepared myself to deal with the grief of a man who had just found his only daughter murdered. Little did I know that I had just started a case that would last longer than the careers of most police officers. The investigation went well at first, just like I had hoped. I was teamed with a young Pennsylvania State Police criminal investigator named Rich Matas, who was also working his first homicide. The case quickly brought to light 5 good, solid suspects, and we worked hard on all of them. That was the good part at first. The bad part was explaining to Peter and Mary Jane, those are Catherine's parents, how the case was going and to try to explain why it had stalled. We were not able to narrow down the list of 5 suspects, and we could not rule any of them out or in. Peter took the news much better than I could have done, but Mary Jane never really recovered from the murder. I stayed in contact with the Coultries over the long years. and always tried to speak to Peter. It was much easier for me to explain to him instead of Mary Jane that I had not forgotten his daughter, and I was always looking for a new lead. But I had always had to tell him that it was not yet solved. Janet Walsh became more than a dead body on a bed for me because of her family. She became a real person who died much too young and left behind a family that loved her dearly. I went from being a young patrolman and honed my skills to become a detective with the Beaver County District Attorney's Office. I became very successful at solving murders, all except that first one. But perseverance and luck came through, and I finally got to visit Peter Coultry again. His wife, Mary Jane, did not live to hear the news, but Peter learned that after more than 30 years, we had made an arrest in his daughter's case. He testified at the preliminary hearing but died before the trial. I promised him at the hospital that justice would prevail. Peter's son honored me by asking me to serve as a pallbearer at his funeral. It was one of the proudest and most difficult moments of my life. Okay, so that was the end of the article. I'm going to put some context around this for you. Well, not just for you, but for myself, because I was not familiar with the case. I couldn't just stop at that article that doesn't explain much about who Andy Gall is and what his career was like with the Beaver County District Attorney's Office. It looks like this case with Catherine Janet Walsh took some dramatic turns over the years as it sat cold. After they got to solving it, actually. Like I said, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but you know how I do it on this show. It was some 34 years after Catherine Janet Walsh was murdered that they identified a suspect. And it turns out that this suspect was a former council person, or actually he was a council person at the time that he was arrested. I'm just going to share a little bit of information from a couple articles that I found. And the victim's name is Catherine Janet, and the 48 Hours episode on her case is called Janet's Secret. I go back and forth. Everyone goes back and forth between either calling her Catherine or Janet. So I think I'm just going to call her Catherine Janet. I haven't seen the 48 Hours episode, and I don't know what the secret was. But if there's a politician involved, I'd almost bet my firstborn, well, she's actually my only born, that this had something to do with some sort of affair or sexual impropriety. So, in this article from a CBS affiliate in Pittsburgh from November of 2013, it stated, former Bridgewater Councilman Gregory Scott Hopkins has been found guilty of third-degree murder in the 1979 strangling death of 23-year-old Catherine Janet Walsh. Walsh's body was found in her apartment with a handkerchief tied around her neck and her wrists bound. Hopkins' family had no comment as they left the courthouse Friday morning. However, Walsh's family is looking forward to the closure that this verdict provides. I hate to be a stickler for detail. The first time you asked me that, I said, this is the start of closure. The door is almost latched shut. When I hear the sentence that he finally gets and see that latch finally close on that door, it will be closure for myself. My father, my brother, my mother, they're going to have closure in the afterlife, but for me, it will be here very soon, said Francesco Caltieri. During the trial, Hopkins took the stand and admitted to a sexual affair with Walsh. However, he said it must have been old semen because he was not in the apartment the night of the murder. Dr. Cyril Wecht, testifying for the prosecution, concluded that the semen found on Walsh's nightgown, sheets, and the rope were the result of sexual activity during her strangulation. So in another article from a local newspaper called The Times, it reported on Hopkins' sentencing on February 25th, 2014 with the following article. While friends and family of Catherine Janet Walsh tearfully testified Wednesday about the impact of her murder and what it has had done to them over the past 34 years, her convicted killer, through his attorney, maintained his innocence. Beaver County Judge Harry Knafelk, it's Knafelc, sentenced Gregory Scott Hopkins, 67, of Bridgewater, to serve 8 to 16 years in prison for the September 1st, 1979 murder of Walsh in her Monica home. A jury convicted Hopkins of third-degree murder after a lengthy trial in November. Hopkins will get credit for time served in the Beaver County Jail since he was charged. Before the sentence was handed down, Walsh's friend, brother, and husband all addressed the court and Hopkins. Francesco Caltieri, Walsh's brother, said that Janet Walsh was more than a sister but also his friend. That event ruined my life, Caltieri said of his sister's murder. I haven't been the same since. He was tearful and emotional as he recounted how he became paranoid during her death, not knowing who had killed her. He said his brother Joe, who had since passed away, would burst into tears at the mention of their sister's name and cried himself to sleep for a long time after her death. Joe was just so happy to have a little sister. He was going to protect her and take care of her. It devastated him that he failed, Caltieri said. My mother, shortly thereafter, became a zombie. There were days and days on end where she wouldn't come out of her bedroom. She became a hollow shell. Walsh's father, Peter Caltieri, lived to see Hopkins arrested but died before trial. And dreamers, if there is a little bit of confusion about the family's last name, Janet Catherine was married, so Walsh was her married name. But her brother, Francesco, he uses the original spelling of their family name, and I guess apparently the family had changed it, maybe so it sounded a little less foreign. It kind of sounds Italian to me. But Peter, his last name is Caltri, and his son uses Caltieri. He did live to see Hopkins arrested, but he died before the trial, like I said. Caltieri said his father was old school and didn't show emotion. It was almost taboo to talk about Janet. Caltieri then turned his attention to Hopkins. He asked Judge Knafelc to give Hopkins a 34-year sentence. Give him the same time incarcerated that he caused myself and my family to be incarcerated, he said. Mr. Hopkins, you took my sister's life and it was not yours to take. My religion tells me I'm supposed to pray for you. You're the one that needs it. I'm supposed to forgive you, but I'm not there yet. I wish for once in your life that you would man up, tell us for God's sake why. I'm not praying for you anytime soon. You can go straight to hell. Scott Walsh, who was married to Janet at the time of her murder, said that he was devastated. There is not a day goes by that I don't think about it. He said that he was considered a suspect and wondered who and why someone would have killed Janet. He said he dealt with years of anxiety and depression following her death. He told Hopkins it was clear that the only person that he ever cared about was himself. Well, dreamers, it turns out that there is a big twist in this story. The very first article I read to you was written by the investigator in the severed head case, Andy Gall. He wrote that 2 years before Hopkins's conviction was overturned. So at the time, the case was solved and closed when he wrote that article for CBS.com. But in 2020, Gregory Hopkins' conviction was overturned. He was exonerated and the murder charges against him were subsequently dropped. In an article on lawandcrime.com, it said, exonerated city councilman sues investigators who used fake expert testimony in 1979 cold case murder of his lover. So, renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Sarah Wecht? Yep, that's right. He messed this case up. The article says, a former city council member in Pennsylvania is suing 3 police officers who were in charge of the investigation that led to his wrongful conviction on a cold case murder charge. According to Pittsburgh ABC affiliate WTAE, attorneys for Gregory Hopkins announced the lawsuit Wednesday morning. This article's from 2022, by the way. The filing reportedly alleges that former Monica Police Department investigator Andrew Gall, who currently works for the Beaver County Detective Bureau, in league with Pennsylvania State Police investigators Rocco DeMaiolo and Ashley Mangan, I'm so sorry I'm butchering these names, they intentionally charged Hopkins with murder despite knowing that he was innocent. In 2013, that's kind of an inflammatory statement, but this is lawandcrime.com, so I think it's worded a little biased-ish, but I'll get to how I feel about this case at the end. I'm not quite sure, but we'll talk about it just a little bit. Then we'll get back to the severed head. In 2013, Hopkins was convicted of the 1979 cold case murder of 23-year-old Catherine Janet Walsh. The deceased woman's body was found face down in her own bed in Monica with a bandana tied around her neck. Her hands were bound behind her back with the belt of a bathrobe. That gruesome discovery was made by her father, who had a key to the apartment after Walsh's employer called him to say his daughter had not appeared for work. Police initially looked to at least 3 suspects in the Walsh murder: her estranged husband, Scott Walsh, a man who followed her and her friends to a restaurant after they had met at a bar earlier the night that she died, Robert McGrail, and Hopkins, her illicit lover and man who had built the home that she and her husband previously lived in together. Each man, however, provided police with an alibi for their general whereabouts at the time that the victim was determined to have died. The case went cold for decades. Science caught up with us, police said in 2012 after Hopkins, then a city councilman in the borough of Bridgewater, was arrested. Investigators had reopened the case 2 years earlier and then, with a DNA profile in hand, surreptitiously obtained DNA from the since exonerated man after he discarded a disposable water cup. According to the National Registry of Exoneration, the NRE, a joint project between 3 law schools across the United States, the prosecution's case was largely premised on the so-called quote-unquote expert testimony of Dr. Sarah Wecht, a forensic pathologist in Pittsburgh, who drew inferences from Hopkins's semen, which was found on Catherine's bedsheet, nightgown, and the bathrobe belt used to tie her hands. Hopkins admitted to having an affair with Catherine Janet Walsh that included 2 or 3 sex acts on the bed where she died. But, he said, the final tryst occurred roughly a month before she was killed. In his testimony, Dr. Wecht did not date the semen found. Rather, he said it was likely left on the morning the victim was killed and was unlikely to have been deposited during previous sexual encounters. The pathologist made other inferences. Dr. Wecht said that the location of the seminal fluid in both areas where the fluid was identified was consistent with Janet's position when found, the NRE summary of the case notes states. Dr. Wecht told the jury that Walsh died due to strangulation during sexual activity hours before the discovery of her body. He stated that, given the DNA analysis, there was no evidence a third person was present. The lack of evidence of forced entry suggested her killer was known to her, he said. During trial, others testified that Walsh's estranged husband's DNA was also present, as well as a third unidentified male DNA profile. Still, Hopkins was convicted of the murder in the 3rd degree. As it turned out, none of Dr. Wecht's inferences were scientific at all. They were not based on any forensic method. They were just his opinions packaged as what a court would later call a novel scientific opinion. And since those opinions were allowed to be presented to the jury, they should have, before the jury heard them, been subject to the federal standard for evaluating expert testimony. That failure by Hopkins's trial attorney, the Pennsylvania Superior Court ruled in April of 2020 that there was enough to reverse his conviction. A new trial was ordered, but the charges were eventually dismissed. In January of this year, after a motion was filed by his appellate attorney. So dreamers, as it stands, the lawsuit that has been filed against Andy Gall and 2 others is still in litigation, and Catherine Janet Walsh's case goes back to square one. I mean, that's a frustrating thing to think about, right? I mean, I apologize again for going off on this tangent. We're here to talk about the severed head, and as always, things just went off the rails. But once I decided to Google Andy Gall, who was being interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, the layers of Catherine Janet's story just kept piling on, and I couldn't just leave you without the wind-up, right? Well, that's the guy that they've talked to about the severed head, Andy Gall. He's the same investigator who had shown up first at Catherine Walsh's murder scene back in 1979. He was involved in her cold case when it was reopened and when it was solved and the trial happened and all of that stuff. So like I said in his interview about the severed head case, whenever there's something weird, it's call Andy. So back to the severed head of Economy, Pennsylvania. Andy Gall said that when he got there and took a look at the head, it appeared to him that the head had not been laying there for very long. The time of the year that this took place was very late fall, and he noted that there were still leaves falling from the trees in this forest. Oh, and by the way, as I was writing this, I had just been tagged in a meme by one of our listeners, Alyssa, something about a forest being a forest until a dead body is found, then it's called a wooded area. So the leaves are falling in this wooded area. The head was found on top of the leaves with no leaves on top of it. When they measured the distance that the head was from the roadside, it was approximately 31 feet or about 9.5 meters from the road. And for being a severed head randomly tossed into this wooded area, it was in pretty good condition. There was no decomposition. Investigators also noted that the nose was slightly pressed a little flat into the side, leading them to speculate that the head had been inside something that held it, like maybe a box or a cooler or something like that. I don't know how severed heads are transported. Maybe in a duffel bag? Did any of you see that stupid movie, 8 Heads in a Duffel Bag? I don't know what possessed me to see that in theaters back in 1997, but that is definitely 95 minutes of my life that I will never get back. Andy Gall said that he was able to determine that the head was that of a woman. She had curly gray hair. She was a little older, in her 60s at least, possibly 80. So, Andy's looking at this head, and he wants to see some blood evidence, maybe some spatter around a wound, a bullet hole, anything that can give him an idea of perhaps how this person died. I mean, aside from the obvious, being separated from the rest of her body. But Andy quickly determined that there was no indication that anything violent happened to this head. Again, aside from the obvious. There were no head wounds. In fact, when it came to whether or not there was even a crime to be investigated in the first place, wasn't even clear to them at this point. But it had to be treated as a homicide until the evidence revealed that it's something else. Eventually, a team of investigators were called out to the area to do a boots-on-the-ground grid search of the surrounding wooded areas to look for anything else that might be related to whatever it is they have going on here. They wanted to make sure that if there were any more heads or body parts that they're collected. But Andy said when it came to crime scenes, this was the one that yielded the least amount of evidence out of all the scenes that he had investigated throughout his career. He also called it one of the most bizarre scenes as well. This is a case unlike anything any of these investigators had ever encountered in their careers. So they were feeling this strong desire to try and identify this woman as soon as possible. As strange as it was, this was still somebody's loved one. So they carefully collected the head, they placed it in a cooler, So I guess that is how severed heads are transported. And they took it over to the medical examiner's office. When they got there, they put this cooler down on their stainless steel table. The two pathologists were standing there, described themselves as literally stunned. And I'm sure it takes a lot to stun someone who examines dead bodies for a living. Autopsy technician Timothy Mankiewicz said in his Unsolved Mysteries interview that all their jaws hit the floor, while their initial reaction was the same as the first responding officers. Is this head for real? The woman's hair had been styled. She did have some makeup on, and her eyes were closed. So the medical examiner said something that kind of made me chuckle a little bit. Not a lot, because we're talking about a severed head, and there's so very little humor to be found in this story. But he said something along the lines of, normally when you find a head on the side of the road, I wouldn't think that there's anything normal about finding a head on the side of the road. And there's not, but as he finished his sentence, he said, normally when you find a head on the side of the road, there's been animal and insect activity, as well as environmental factors like weather conditions, as well as the usual human decomposition. That was what was unusual about this head found on the side of the road. Again, aside from the obvious being a head found on the side of the road, is that this head did not have any type of animal activity, no insects, nor had it been affected by the elements or by any stages of decomposition. So they started to think that this was a head used in the making of a movie or a TV show as a prop, but that quickly was washed away because they were able to determine that the head was indeed a real human head. This was no movie prop. The head was remarkably well preserved. The skin had taken on somewhat of a rubbery-like texture and feel. The woman's lips were plump with very little give, and they kept their shape well, all things considered. To the medical examiner, the head was in relatively excellent shape and condition. Again, all things considered, so how is this possible? How is this human head still so well put together? Hair, makeup, no decomp. The medical examiner determined that the head had been embalmed by a licensed funeral professional. Based on the hair and makeup and the level of care and detail that went into the embalming and preparation process of this woman's head, this meant that this woman was made to look as good as possible for her own funeral, for the sake of the family to be able to view her. After the body was embalmed, and perhaps after she was viewed by her family and loved ones, it was then that her head was severed from her body. And the way that the head was severed was also done in a way that seemed that whoever did it knew what they were doing. The medical examiner said in his interview that someone didn't just take an axe or a machete and chop off this woman's head hastily. The autopsy report said that the head was cleanly cut between the joints of the spine, and the cut was made from the front through the skin and cleanly severed the trachea. The report also said that the spinal cord was also cut with medical precision, leading the medical examiner to opine that the cut was made with very, very sharp instruments and possibly even a scalpel. Now, if this story isn't already totally weird and creepy, the next part really got to me and had me quickly deciding that I wanted to talk about this case with you guys. And then when I posted in the Facebook group about it, one of our admins, Rebecca, said that they don't get Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix where she lives in England. So yeah, you may not have seen this episode yet. But there are some places where they don't even have the option. So the medical examiner said that the most mysterious part of this severed head that he discovered was when he opened up her eyes. Okay, so I've talked about autopsies a couple of times in the past. I think the most depth that we went into in an autopsy had to do with the unusual death of Kendrick Johnson. Remember that story out of Valdosta, Georgia? He was a young man who was found dead inside a wrestling mat in his high school gym. I did these episodes with Justin over there at Mysterious Circumstances. Kendrick's death was ruled accidental misadventure positional asphyxiation. But his parents went on this years-long campaign to try and prove that his death was a homicide and not an accident, but ended up not really getting anywhere with it because it seemed like the consensus that this was an accident stood. Then, when the Johnson family weren't getting the results that they wanted or were expecting, they began putting out misinformation in the media, as well as filing an unsuccessful lawsuit against a whole bunch of people that they claimed conspired to cover up Kendrick's quote-unquote murder, as they called it. And that ended up costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars when they were ordered to repay everyone that they had filed their lawsuit against, because they had all these legal costs that resulted from being sued in the first place. All of that is to say is I don't really like talking about autopsy details very much, but because this case is such a mystery, there isn't much else to discuss beyond the theories and speculation. So, when the medical examiner opened up the woman's eyes, underneath the eyelids were what are called plastic caps. He said that it is typical to use these in embalming. They are placed over the decedent's eyeballs in order to hold the shape of the eyeball when the eyelids are closed, so that they don't appear sunken in. And if, for some reason, like in this case, those eyeball caps are removed, underneath one should find the decedent's eyeballs. But in the severed head, her eyes were not there. And in their place were small red bouncy balls. You know those small ones that you can get out of a gumball machine? 2 of them, 2 red ones. How weird is that? To pull those caps off and to see 2 small red spheres in this woman's eye sockets. I think I would pass out if I witnessed something like that. For those small red balls to be in place of eyeballs, according to the medical examiner, it's highly unusual. In fact, nobody that he's ever spoken to or reached out to has ever heard of such practices. And this is what kind of reminded me of Kendrick Johnson's case. If you remember, when he was exhumed for his second autopsy, it was discovered that all of his internal organs were missing, and instead of being stuffed with material that is typically used to help keep the body shaped like sawdust or cotton or some other absorbent materials, Kendrick was stuffed with newspaper. He was also, normally they also bag up the internal organs and place them inside with, the whatever they stuff the body with, but that didn't even happen in Kendrick's case either. The organs were missing. They should have been inside his body still. And as unusual as that may sound, when we covered this case, we were able to find that newspaper can be used to save money, and it had been used more often in the past, and that it's not necessarily best practices, but it isn't unheard of. However, these red bouncy balls, though, totally unheard of. So for investigators, those red rubber balls were one of the most significant and important pieces of evidence that they had in terms of hopefully being able to identify this woman. In fact, they all thought that the rubber balls were going to be the key to solving this case and closing it. They reached out to a variety of mortuaries in the area. Obviously, there was someone somewhere working at some funeral home that uses red rubber bouncy balls to replace eyeballs during their embalming process. In the Unsolved Mysteries episode, a funeral director in Pennsylvania happened to be at a local courthouse at the same time that the medical examiner and Andy Gall were also there. A discussion about the severed head was had, and this funeral director was asked about the practice of using rubber balls in place of eyeballs underneath those plastic eye caps, and he was like, nope, never heard of it. From what he said in his interview, it's my understanding that even if the eyeballs were removed for some reason, those plastic eye caps are all that are used in order to maintain the shape of the eye during embalming. So someone did this unusual thing to this woman's eyes, and investigators really, really wanted to know who. For a long time after the discovery of the severed head, Andy Gall would ask every single funeral director or licensed funeral professional that he encountered about the rubber balls, and nobody he had ever come across had ever heard of such a thing. This is a thing that literally nobody does and nobody's heard of. Then one afternoon, Andy Gall had gone out to lunch at one of his usual spots, and he happened to notice that there was a gumball machine that had bouncy rubber balls in it. I guess it had not yet occurred to him that the red balls found in those eye sockets of the severed head were technically a child's toy. He went and did some research and found that red rubber balls were manufactured in China and are one of their most sold products around the world. Investigators in Beaver County reached out to their counterparts in China, and all that did was lead to more disappointment. Those balls were so common that they're all so similar. They have nothing about them to distinguish when or where they were manufactured. Therefore, those red rubber balls were virtually untraceable. For Andy Gall, the red bouncy balls, toys essentially, being placed into this woman's eye holes was weird. One of the weirdest things, if not the weirdest thing he had ever seen. 2 days after the discovery of the severed head, a more extensive search of the wooded area was coordinated. Andy Gall had a feeling that there might be more body parts dumped out in the surrounding areas around the location where the head was found, so search dogs were also brought in, but no other body parts were found. Another component of the search involved speaking to people who lived near the area as well. And that is when they came across a gentleman by the name of Jay Grabner. Jay resided directly across the street from the location of the severed head. The police activity the day of the search prompted Jay to approach some of the officers to talk to them about the head. Instead of talking to him there at the scene, they asked Jay if he would be willing to come down to the station and to give his statement there where they could be audio and video recorded, to which Jay Grabner agreed. Grabner had somewhat of a vested interest in the discovery of the severed head. He had mentioned there being crows squawking and a disturbance down by where the head was found. I personally would have been suspicious at that point right away when he talked about the crows squawking, because they had made it pretty clear that there was no animal activity, and that's because of the embalming process. The severed head would not be attracting any birds. But not only was Grabner expressing interest in the discovery of the head itself, but he also expressed some interest in the young man who found the head, that 15-year-old. They showed some clips of Grabner's interview, and in part of it, he said, "To me, the situation is just too convenient, too pretty for a kid to come up with this." It was clear to the investigators that Jay Grabner was making a concerted effort to point the finger at the 15-year-old. Grabner continued by stating, "I'm not saying he did it, but I'm just saying it was too conveniently placed, that it wanted to be found." The investigators said that it seemed like Jay Grabner was attempting to insert himself into the middle of this case. He wanted to be involved, and so he, for whatever reason, wanted this attention and focus to be on himself. He was very loud and animated in his interview, and the officers, they were like, yeah, this guy is too much. Jay Grabner wanted the police to hear him loud and clear. He wanted them to listen to what he had to say and to take what he said into consideration in their investigation. I guess maybe it made Jay Grabner feel important that he was the one who lived closest to the location of the severed head. Some of the things that Jay Grabner said were so strange that he was slowly morphing himself from witness into person of interest, and he pretty much walked himself into that position single-handedly. The detective asked him, "Okay, so to make sense of what you're saying, this 15-year-old kid would kill someone, cut up their body, and put the head in the forest? I mean, officially turning it into a wooded area, am I right? And then call 911 on himself." Jay Grabner was like, "Yeah, that's a scenario. In fact, Jay Grabner believed that that was a most plausible and likely scenario. And the investigators were like, why would this kid do something like that? And Jay Grabner, he really didn't have any response or explanation. At the end of the interview, when it all came down to it, there was absolutely nothing that Jay Grabner said that was at all useful to the investigation. All he did was blow a bunch of hot air, provided a ton of speculation and conjecture, and was absolutely no help. He didn't see anything, he didn't witness anything, he didn't know anything, nothing at all. Investigators also spoke to the 15-year-old, and their overall impression of him was that he just had the unfortunate luck of making this grisly discovery. The 15-year-old in his interview came across as genuine and honest. There was nothing about him at all that seemed off. He wasn't nervous. He was forthcoming and answered their questions straightforwardly to the best of his ability. When they asked him who he told about the head, he said other than calling 911, the only other person he told at the time was his grandma. He didn't text his friends. He didn't take pictures. There was nothing weird about the way that this kid conducted himself after finding the head. Investigators even went so far as to speak to the kid's neighbors to see if they had anything unusual or strange to report about him, and still, there was nothing. The 15-year-old was quickly ruled out as having anything to do with the head ending up there in the wooded area other than being the one that found it. So with that, the questions remained. Where is the rest of this woman's body located? Who would do something like this, like leave a severed head in the forest, forever transforming it into a wooded area? And most importantly, who is this woman? In order to try and figure out the identity of the head, DNA was taken, and that was to be entered into the national database. Not only that, but the genealogical databases as well, in order to see if they could find a match to herself or a blood relative in an effort to figure out who this woman was. Samples were taken from the hair, the brain, the teeth, and the skin. Samples from the lower back part of her skull were sent to North Texas University for DNA testing. And in the episode, Andy Gall said, nothing. They sent brain, tissue, and hair samples to FBI in Quantico, Virginia for DNA testing. And again, Andy said, nothing. In the years subsequent to the discovery of the head, which had now been almost 10 years, they sent DNA samples at least a half dozen times, and every time they came up with nothing. And when Andy Gall says nothing, he doesn't mean that they weren't able to find a match. The analysts running the DNA tests were unable to develop a genetic profile for the severed head at all, leading investigators without a DNA sample to enter into the various databases in order to try and search for a match. They eventually came to learn that once a body is embalmed, the embalming process destroys the decedent's DNA. There is no DNA as of yet to be had, making it impossible to even begin to search for a match. What they were going to have to do was turn to the public for help. They needed to develop some kind of composite drawing of the head and to get that out to the media to see if it brought about anyone who might recognize this woman. Of course, they didn't want to post up an actual picture of the severed head, so they turned to a forensic sketch artist at the Borough University of Pennsylvania. And the sketch artist, in her interview on Unsolved Mysteries, she pointed out that she's usually the last resort when it comes to trying to identify a John or Jane Doe these days. That the police, at that point when they come to her, they've exhausted all other means of trying to ID a person, so they turn to the drawings. There's always a chance that someone out there recognizes the sketch. There were some features about the severed head that the artist felt would be relatively recognizable if someone who knew her in life saw the sketch. Her hairstyle, the color of her hair, she had a couple of small moles on her face. Because of the wrinkle patterns and the way that she aged, it appeared as though she may have been a smoker. So the artist came up with a sketch. Investigators held a press conference and released the drawing. And as Andy Gall so disappointingly put it every time, they came up with nothing. Since nothing came of that, they went back to the same artist and asked her to create a bust of the woman. The idea is to give the public a three-dimensional look at her. She might have some prominent features when looking at her from a profile perspective, maybe a distinctive chin or a prominent nose or forehead. And one of those features might be something that will trigger someone's memory. But dreamers, you know what I was thinking? I see an inherent problem with the whole idea of leaning on the public for help in identifying the severed head. Because who's going to think that their mom or their grandma or their auntie or other relative that this may be, who's going to think that, oh, that must be Grammy's head because it looks like her? Because they think Grammy is either buried somewhere or cremated. Why would her head end up in a wooded area in western Pennsylvania? I don't think the relatives of this person would even be paying attention, that close of attention, because they think they know where their loved one's body is in its entirety. But anyway, the bust was created, and it did provide a different and distinctive look about this woman in life, much more so than the two-dimensional composite sketch. Another press conference was held, and the image of the bust was released to the media. And once the bust was seen on the news and on the internet, it did generate a little bit more activity on the tip lines than the composite sketch did. The thought was they were going to receive information from somewhere about a grave that may have been robbed, or a mausoleum broken into, or something like that, where a head had been reported stolen, possibly even a whole body. And there was indeed a promising lead that cropped up from only about 2 hours south of Economy Borough in the county of Fayette. The coroner saw the report of the severed head and saw the bust. And in his jurisdiction, they did have a crypt that had been broken into. The casket had been placed inside the wall. That wall had been broken open, and whoever did this pulled the casket out, and upon the discovery of this break-in, it was discovered that the head of the body was missing. So, in doing the math, they've got one body minus one head in this county, 90 miles or 144 kilometers north in another county. They've got one head minus one body. This has got to be connected. Here's the thing. The head that was stolen in Fayette County, that all happened way back on August 4th, 1988, some nearly 26 years prior to the discovery of the severed head in Economy Borough, which occurred on December 12th, 2014. Back on that day in 1988, police were called to the mausoleum where a woman named Teresa DiCarlo was interred. The first responding officer, also interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, stated that Teresa was a lifelong resident of the southwestern Pennsylvania county, and she died in 1952. It was her casket that had been pulled from the mausoleum wall. Whoever it was that did this broke the mausoleum's rear window, gained entry through there, broke into the wall, smashed open Teresa's coffin, and apparently stole her head. It appeared that a very sharp instrument was also used to separate her head from her body, similar to the unidentified severed head in Economy. An exhaustive search was launched for Teresa's head, but it was never found, and no other graves were ever desecrated. Usually when graves are robbed, people are looking for valuables, but whatever jewelry Teresa had on was untouched. And this here takes us back to what we've discussed in the past that was going on in the United States and around the world, really, at that time. And it's a time frame that did include the late 80s, and that was Satanic Panic. I've talked about it before. We've discussed it extensively when we covered the McMartin preschool case. More recently, in the Manson Tunnel murder. Both of those cases had a lot of talk about satanic worship, satanic rituals, sacrifices, etc., etc. But I typically brush that notion aside, at least in the cases that I've covered, because they're typically more simple answers than satanic panic. Well, I don't know if the McMartin preschool had any simple answers, but all that satanic stuff, it was so extensive. And all the years that that case carried on and everything that had happened and all the lives that were ruined, all the stories that were made up about the preschool, none of it was true. It wasn't simple, but all it was a figment of some mom's imagination that started it all. But this, I'll have to say, once they discovered that the only thing missing was Teresa's head, they entertained the theory that this was related to occult or satanic activity. And to be honest, dreamers, this time, I think that that could be the case in this situation. I mean, why take someone's head unless you're doing something really strange or out there or weird? Or maybe this was a prank? Teenagers? A dare? I don't know. It's so strange that I would, in this case, for one of the very few times ever, consider satanic activity as a motive behind this head gone missing. The officer who responded to the 1988 missing head case said in his interview that there was satanic activity in this area, and he said that they received calls and reports and complaints about satanic activity taking place. It's also a wooded area. He said that they had parties out there and, these people that were getting police called on them were in the graveyards doing whatever they're doing. Now, this kind of reminds me of the West Memphis 3 case where we have these older teenagers in the late 80s, early 90s. Well, the West Memphis was early 90s. But based on the way that they dressed or how these kids, hung out or the music they listened to or they're partying and drinking and doing drugs, they ended up getting accused of being devil worshippers. And that's not really what's going on here. It's just a perception of them. That's what I tend to think about the West Memphis 3. But this officer said in his interview, quote, "Now, the key thing, the most prized possession of a satanic cult was to have a human head. That's what they wanted, and that's what they were looking for." And again, I wouldn't put it past some of these kids doing weird stuff. But in this particular case, I'm not as quickly to completely dismiss the idea of this sort of occult activity taking place, mainly because I didn't really look that deeply into it, so I can't officially dismiss it out of the ideas and theories that I might have about it. And the reason is because it turned out that even though it would make sense that the severed head could have belonged to Teresa DiCarlo, it turned out that it was not. The severed head that was found in Economy Borough had dental work that was not in existence at the time that Teresa was alive. The head that was found by the 15-year-old was much more recently deceased. And to be honest, I'm not sure if Teresa's head, it's because it was found more than 60 years after she died, would still look so fresh, but I don't know. I didn't research it. I'm just not really stomaching this episode very well, and I'm not really feeling like Googling severed heads and human decomposition this morning. I would have delved into it more if this was Teresa's head, but it turned out not to be. It was very chilling, however, how much the severed head resembled Teresa DiCarlo, but the dental work was a dead giveaway, for lack of a better term. The head was not that of Teresa. And with that, the investigation started all over again, back at square one. They were no closer to giving the severed head of Economy, Pennsylvania a name. They still had nothing. In the ongoing look into this mystery, investigators did look into opportunity. When in the world did the person who removed this head from its body have the chance to do it? When did they have the time and place to remove this head with surgical precision? Because they know that Jane Doe was embalmed. That means that she had gone through the process of a funeral. Investigators wondered if the body had been desecrated in the time in between her funeral and her burial or cremation. Even when someone is cremated, they're embalmed for the viewing, right? After the viewing, the body is then transported over to the crematory. And it's possible for the body to be kept either in the funeral home or in the crematory for a few days before it's actually cremated. And this would be an ample window of time for someone to have access to a body, to remove the head, to get it over to the crematory, and to go through that process. And with the ashes being all that's left, the family and loved ones are none the wiser that their dead family member was missing their head when they were cremated. And it seems that it is more likely that she was cremated because usually when you have somebody who's buried, you have the funeral service, and then everybody goes over to the graveside and the casket's placed into the ground. So they think that it was likely whomever this severed head belongs to was kept for a couple days before it was sent to the crematory, and it was during that window of time that her head was removed. There isn't as big of a window of time between a funeral and a burial as there is between a funeral and a cremation. And this is where they start discussing the idea of selling body parts on the black market. And this is another thing that I really don't like talking about too much. In fact, I don't think I've ever really discussed black market body parts trade. But it's a thing that goes on, and that's the direction the investigation into the severed head went next. They discovered that there are funeral home directors that do in fact sell body parts of their customers. I don't know what else to call the decedents who brought into the funeral home other than customers. Maybe clients? I don't know. Without any other directions to go, the investigators did consider that their Jane Doe's severed head had been a part of some underground black market body parts trading ring. There was a reporter who was interviewed on the Unsolved Mysteries episode, and he was doing some kind of expose about black market body trade and became interested in the severed head when he heard about it. He was wondering if she was perhaps a part of that industry. This journalist said that there were those out there who deal in this body trading and sales of body parts, and there really isn't much out there regulating how all of that actually takes place. And that's unlike the practice of organ donation and transplantation, which is something that is heavily regulated and overseen to ensure that it is done properly and legally. But this journalist said, when it comes to human body and human body parts brokers, there are apparently what are called chop shops, where body parts are harvested and sold. These places literally cut up bodies and sell off the parts, he said, usually for interested parties to conduct research with. He said that conferences are held in hotel banquet rooms and are reserved by those body brokers, and they'd be selling parts just like that. Not only that, they'd have demonstrations for audiences where they can see these bodies or body parts being worked on, whatever that means. So this journalist, he's interested in this embalmed severed head. Without any information as to who she was or how her head ended up in a wooded area, he began to think perhaps the body brokers got to her. So one of the things this journalist ended up doing was visiting the wooded area where the head was found in order to get an idea of the environment in which her head was so unceremoniously dumped. And like the investigators who launched that search 2 days after the head was found, when this journalist arrived to take a look at the location, Mr. Jay Grabner emerged from his home once again, curious as to what this new set of people were there for. What are they looking for? What they're interested in? He's just nosy. He came across as that neighbor once again trying to insert himself into the severed head story. Well, they called him the neighbor that just liked to insert himself into any situation. Jay Grabner was overly eager to help, considering how very, very little he did actually help. Again, he had nothing useful to provide to the journalist, except making himself look suspicious once again. Grabner pointed his finger at the teenager who found the head, But this journalist, like the police, did not think it was plausible that this 15-year-old stole a well-preserved, well-embalmed human head, managing to cut it with that kind of surgical precision, then taking that head into the forest, leaving it now in this, what we're going to call a wooded area, then making like he discovered the head and then calling 911 on himself. It made no sense. So the story gets even more weird. It turns out that Jay Grabner and this 15-year-old used to be friends. I found it to be kind of an unlikely friendship, but you've got this older man that says he's kind of taken this kid under his wing to teach him things about hunting or sports or whatever. But I'm always a little leery about non-relatives stepping into these roles as fatherly or grandfatherly figures in these boys' lives. But there isn't anything that any of the investigators said in their interviews on Unsolved Mysteries about it, but my mind is the mind that wandered there, that this friendship just feels really uncomfortable to me. Just because all we know thus far about Jay Grabner is that he's a nosy neighbor who likes to inject himself into other people's business. In another interview he gave with investigators, of the 15-year-old, Grabner said, "I'd talk to him about baseball. He'd come over and sit on my truck tailgate at the front of my thing, and he'd ask me if I'd come over, and I said, I'll come down with your grandfather. We'll pitch baseball. I'll show you how to stand and swing the bat." So dreamers, I don't know. Here we find out that the 15-year-old actually has a grandfather present in his life. And so to me, it kind of sounded like Jay Grabner was trying to make this whole thing sound less weird by saying that he would hang out with him and his grandfather. Maybe Grabner and the grandfather were buddies. I have no clue. But nothing of the sort was alluded to in the episode. This is all stuff that my mind goes to, and these ideas are bouncing around in my head. The detective said at some point, Grabner and the 15-year-old had a falling out, and the two of them stopped being friends, and Grabner refused to allow this kid over to his house or onto his property anymore. And that is really suspicious to me too. In his videotaped interview with investigators, Grabner was asked a very direct and pointed question, but his answer didn't actually answer the question, which I always find to be interesting. I have a whole case about that. I want to talk about it one of these days, and that would be Leticia Stock. Remember? I talked about the case in the group. If you don't know it, don't worry. I'm probably going to go over it. But if you do know the case, then you know what I'm talking about. She literally talked to FBI for like 4 or 5 hours and answered absolutely none of his questions. It was really strange. Anyway, Jay Grabner was asked if the 15-year-old had ever threatened him. Grabner stated, quote, "I told him I don't want you coming around this house ever again." So it kind of sounds like to me, of the two of them, that Grabner would have been the one that is more likely to issue threats based on the tone and the way that he said that. In the Unsolved Mysteries episode, they discussed an incident that happened with a horse that took place after the falling out with the 15-year-old. There was a property nearby that belonged to a neighbor of Grabner's, and on this property lived a horse named Ginger. Grabner loved this horse. Again, sticking his nose into other people's places and things. In fact, Andy Gall said that Jay Grabner kind of considered the horse to be his, even though it wasn't. Now that annoys me. He took investigators onto the property and showed them the barn where the horse would come in and out of, and he did an videotaped walkthrough of the area. I actually don't know if he's doing this with investigators or with that journalist. He was videotaped a lot. Well, there came a time when it was discovered that Ginger was injured and bleeding out on the property. And they really don't have an idea of how she came to be that way. A veterinarian was contacted, and according to Grabner, the veterinarian told him that the horse had been stabbed. A couple of weeks after the horse was discovered injured, it died from its injuries. Jay Grabner considered the stabbing and killing of this horse to be a homicide. The horse was buried on the property, and in the video, Grabner is seen placing a big wreath on her grave as if he was mourning a close family member. I totally understand being super attached to pets, But to me, this was a little bit over the top, especially for a horse that he didn't even own. Grabner erected a white cross with her name on it and everything. He was convinced that it was the 15-year-old who stabbed and murdered Ginger, and that he did it in retaliation for the dispute that they had had, whatever it was that ended their friendship, along with him being banned from his property. That seems like an extreme thing for a 15-year-old to do, to stab a horse just to get back at somebody. If that was the case, I mean, whatever, I'm dying to know what this falling out was, but I have no idea. If anybody knows, please tell me. I would really like to know what came between Jay Grabner and this 15-year-old kid. So anyway, following the quote-unquote murder of Ginger the horse, and technically can't be a murder because a murder is something that happens to a human being. So following Ginger's death, neighbors reported to police that Jay Grabner became fixated on getting revenge on this 15-year-old. What he meant by revenge, nobody knew. They weren't sure what to make of Grabner's insistence that he avenge this horse's death. But regardless, this brought up a problem between the person who found the severed head and the person who owns the property that's closest to where the head was found. Jay Grabner only managed to add to the mystery. There was just something off about this man. And the journalist I mentioned, he said that there was another weird thing about Jay Grabner, and that was the fact that he was quite knowledgeable of the black market underground body parts harvesting industry. When he was asked about this theory, Grabner stated in what looks like a TV interview, I think the journalist is videotaping everything, so every encounter that they had with Grabner is on video. They asked him what his theory was about the body trade industry, and Grabner stated, "I don't know. I told him that I thought there were events, and I was the first one to bring it up, that they do seminars at some of these hotels and stuff like that, where they put plastic on the floor and they cut and they experiment and they take eyes and legs and arms, whatever, hearts, kidneys, or whatever." And the journalist said that Grabner knew about these hotel conferences where the banquet rooms would be rented out for body parts harvesting and demonstrations. Grabner also told him that he knew that sometimes body parts were tossed into rubbish bins. The journalist was a little taken aback by the fact that Grabner had this very specific knowledge, admitting that even he didn't know about these hotel conferences and that he had done extensive research as he was working on this piece about the black market body parts trade. I did not know about it either, but I tend to not know about that sort of stuff because I just don't look into black market body parts ever. There's no occasion that I would ever look into that until now. And I'm not really going to dive that deep into it. I've sidetracked us off topic enough in this episode. And so with that, the questions continue to grow. Why in the world would this seemingly unassuming guy, Jay Grabner, know all about this body parts trade industry? The fact that Grabner had this unusual knowledge caused the journalist to suspect him as having knowledge of the severed head and or some kind of involvement. Grabner did show the journalist his property and invited him inside his house, and he noticed that Grabner had a telescope. The journalist asked his cameraman to go down and stand on the exact spot where the head was found. When the cameraman was in position, the journalist looked through the telescope, and sure enough, it was pointed right there, right where the head was located. So they inferred that Grabner was looking at the area where the head was located from his house through that telescope, and again, adding more unanswered questions to this case. Grabner stated, "This is the only spot on the road where the head could be seen from the road, but also from my house from my window." The journalist thought that it may have been Grabner that placed the severed head out there in the wooded area in a location where he could see it from the road from his house. Grabner may have done that, and he could sit back and watch the whole thing unfold from the comfort of his home. Another thing about the location where this head was found is that it was only a few feet away from where Ginger the horse was found injured and bleeding, which is also another significant connection to Jay Grabner. It's also not very far away from where Ginger was ultimately buried. This journalist reporting on the body trade industry theorized that the 15-year-old regularly walked through the wooded area and that Jay Grabner knew that he was probably watching him with his telescope, which is even more creepy when you think about it. The 15-year-old was interested in hunting. That was actually going to be the last weekend of hunting season in the area. The 15-year-old walked this path. Grabner was familiar with his route and his schedule, and perhaps Jay Grabner wanted to set him up to find the head. He knew that if he placed the head in just the right spot, this kid would be the one to find it, and that's ultimately what happened. And all of this information caused Andy Gall to grow suspicious of Jay Grabner as well. Eventually, the journalist worked up to asking Grabner if he would be willing to submit to a polygraph examination. And in the video, Grabner said, "Effing right, you're effing right I will. Think these mother effers think I had something to do with that head?" At this point, Jay Grabner is pretty much yelling at the investigative journalist to a point where it's really an over-the-top overreaction. Grabner yelled, "I'll do it tomorrow. Go get that goddamn thing set up. I'll do it tomorrow." Jay Grabner insisted, so they jumped on the chance to give him a polygraph. They got one of Pennsylvania's best polygraph examiners to come out to administer the test. The 3 questions they wanted answers to were, did you place that severed head in the field? Jay said no. Regarding that severed head found across from your house, did you place that there? Again, he answered no. And did you plan with anyone to place that severed head in that field? Again, he said no. Deception was indicated across all 3 answers that Jay Grabner gave. I don't take polygraph pass or fails too seriously. Like always, I take it with a grain of salt. It is what it is. You make of it what you will. But it doesn't further Jay Grabner as a suspect for me, nor does it lessen him as one either. But for the journalist, after the failed polygraph, he became convinced that Jay Grabner was a liar. A few minutes after the polygraph, the journalist sat down and asked Grabner how the polygraph results made him appear. Grabner said he didn't care because he was telling the truth. He got super defensive. He leaned forward and raised his voice again, stating, "I know nothing about the head, where it came from, or who cooked up the idea to do that," and he slammed his hand down on the table. This guy, Jay Grabner, is very, very aggressive just in regular conversation. "I'm dead straight honest, period. I'm built no other way," is what he said. One of the officers that was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries said that he also became suspicious of Jay Grabner. He stated that he came to believe that Grabner had knowledge of how that severed head ended up in that wooded area, and that he was kind of enjoying this little game that he was playing with law enforcement and the media, like this was some kind of sport to him. This investigator felt like Jay Grabner was feeding them little bits and pieces of information here and there, just enough to keep some interest on himself, but not enough to where he's going to implicate himself either. The journalist said that after every conversation he had with Grabner, he came away feeling a little more suspicious about him because of something that he would say. There was some talk around town that the head belonged to someone close to Grabner, like his mother or something like that. What would make people think that? Well, it had to do with something that Grabner had stored in his own freezer in the basement. His dog that had died. Grabner explained that his best friend was his dog, Jackie, and it looked like it was a Jack Russell Terrier, hence the name. Grabner took the journalist down to his basement, pointed to a standalone freezer, and told him that Jackie was stored in there. If Grabner could store his dog in this freezer, could he store a head? Heck yeah, he could. And we already know that this guy is a strange bird. Jay Grabner's mom died in 1999, some 15 years before the discovery of the head. But when they investigated that angle, they quickly determined that the severed head did not resemble the pictures that existed of Grabner's mom. The head wasn't her. But this still didn't get Grabner off the suspect list. he was still very much at least a person of interest. One of the investigators on the case stated that he was certain that Jay Grabner knew much more than they were ever able to pry out of him. On September 30th, 2020, Jay Grabner drove out to the Ohio Turnpike. He parked on an overpass, and just as an 18-wheeler was about to go under, Jay Grabner leapt off the overpass in front of that truck. In his interview on Unsolved Mysteries, Andy Gall said of Grabner's suicide, "My best lead is gone. He was the last string I had in solving this case." But even if it was Jay Grabner who was responsible for that severed head being placed there across the street from his home, that would have tied up that loose end. But there is still the question of who the severed head belonged to in the first place. Once they did all they could do with the severed head, it was buried in a local cemetery 1 year after she was discovered. She was given a casket so that if and when the remaining body parts are found, she can be buried whole. Her headstone right now says Jane Doe found December 12, 2014. And to this day, everybody on this case is hoping and waiting that someday someone will realize that this is their loved one or their relative or their family member or their friend and come forward with her name so a new headstone can be placed. And that, my dreamers, was the tale of the severed head of Economy, Borough, Pennsylvania. I want to thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to do all the usual stuff that I ask you to do. Come on social media. Come and talk to me. I'm going to post a picture of the bust. If you want to see more pictures, I can post them maybe in the comments. I can't do screenshots on Netflix. What I end up doing is taking pictures of it with my iPad or vice versa with my phone. Don't forget to check out the Strictly Stalking Podcast. You heard that promo in the beginning of this episode. I'll be back soon with another case for you. And as always, until next time, sweet dreams.